So, research on forgiveness makes an important distinction. And I really want to make sure that I share it with you that forgiveness and reconciliation, they're just not the same thing. Forgiveness can happen internally, but reconciliation, on the other hand, it requires relationship. And this matters because a lot of people, they're extremely pressured to just forgive and forget when what is really being asked, can I have access to you again? But those are not the same request. If you look at that, you can forgive someone and still not reopen the relationship itself. And you can release the resentment that still might be there and still keep the boundary. You can understand why someone did what they did, whatever it is, and yet still decide for you that trust has not yet been rebuilt. Because forgiveness, it is actually internal. But access, that's not internal, it's relational. And access requires evidence.
Hey there, Evolver. If you have found this channel, you're probably someone who thinks deeply about life, growth, and the human mind. My name is Amelia, and this is a channel where we explore the psychology, neuroscience, and lived experience of what it actually means to evolve as a human being.
So in my work with couples, individuals, leaders, this is one of the most important distinctions that I see people missing countless times, again and again and again. People often collapse these two concepts, well, three concepts actually: forgiveness, repair, and reconciliation. Well, four, if we really do the math. Forgiveness, repair, reconciliation, and trust into one thing. They think if I forgive, then inherently I also have to reconnect. If they apologized, I have to inevitably move on. If I understand their pain, then I have to tolerate the behavior. And if I still need distance, maybe I'm not healed yet. But that is not emotional maturity, my friends. That is often pressure disguised as healing, and something that I see way more than I would like to name. And when we are on the concept of this, when we talk about maturity, what maturity is the fact that it is being able to separate the internal process from the relational decision points that we're going to talk about in this episode. Forgiveness is one layer. Repair is an entirely other layer. Reconciliation, yup, it's another layer. Trust, that's foundational. And yes, it's another layer. And each one, matter of fact, requires something entirely different, but yet so many of us just kind of collapse all those layers into one. And in the last video at EVE, we talked about how apology and accountability, those two things, don't necessarily go hand in hand for all of us. A real apology is not just, hey, I'm sorry. It includes ownership, impact, and ultimately repair. But even when someone apologizes really well, let's say on the surface with their word choice, etc., that does not automatically mean that trust is in fact restored. As a matter of fact, an apology can open up the door to repair, yes, but it doesn't complete the entire rebuilding of safety that we all need on its own. So this episode in particular is all about what happens after the apology. Do we forgive? Do we reconcile? Do we rebuild trust? At what rate? How do we do that? Do we keep distance from that person who hurt us? And ultimately, how do we know the difference between all of those layers? Because here's the distinction that I want anyone that's watching this, I want you, dear Evolver, to hold. Forgiveness is about your internal relationship to what has happened. Repair, on the other hand, is about acknowledging the rupture and responding to the impact. Reconciliation is about renewed relationship, and trust is about whether the system has had enough evidence to feel safe again. Those are all connected, but they are not, keyword, interchangeable. You can forgive without reconciling. You can repair one moment or a slew of moments without fully rebuilding trust. You can care about someone and still recognize that they do not have safe access to you, nor have they earned it. And that distinction protects people from bypassing their own nervous system in the name of being a good, insert the role, a good sister, a good partner, a good friend, a good family member, a good daughter, a good partner, a good husband, a good leader. It's bypassing. So I have 3 examples here, and I want you to sink into which one resonates the most for you. And with each example per every EVE episode that I try to give, I always have a name attached to that. Obviously, I'm not going to say the name, but I want to make sure that I have in my bones this example, because every single person has a struggle with collapsing these layers. And I've been through it. I know what it feels like. And the number one that I see again and again with individuals, couples, and leaders at all times is that good old family pressure to forgive, right? Keyword forgive with like the air quotes if you're just listening to this in audio. And that is the most common example where you have family or relational pressure to forgive. Now, the example is that someone hurts you. A family member hurts you. I'm not going to go into maybe what that might look like, but maybe they hurt you once. Maybe they hurt you repeatedly. Maybe in ways that were, in the context of the family system, ultimately minimized for years. And eventually, when you actually start setting some of those boundaries that maybe you've been talking with your therapist or a friend or someone that's trying to really support you and what your nervous system needs, when you start setting those boundaries in particular, what ends up happening to the people in your family or for people that think that your needs are too much? What do people say? The one that I have written down is, but they're family. Oh, you just need to forgive, honey. Sweetie, life is too short. Or they did the best that they could. And maybe some of that is true. You know, I've been on both sides of the table, and I understand that honestly, there's always a little bit of truth between what you experience and what the other person does or what someone's saying. And so I want to validate that, right? Maybe some of that truly is true, that they did their best or that they are family. And maybe they did have their own pain. Maybe the reasons they became who they are and reacted and responded to you in the way in which you received was because they have their own reasons. You know, that quote comes to mind, hurt people hurt people. Yeah, that happens. We've all been there unintentionally. But understanding why someone hurt you does not automatically just make them safe. And when you hear those sentiments coming from people who are trying to walk you through this, it's really important for you to name what's happening inside of you. Because forgiveness, in a nutshell, might mean that I'm working on releasing the grip that this layer of forgiveness has on my own inner world. But reconciliation, on the other hand, would actually require questions like, can this person acknowledge what happened and what happened specifically between us? Can they respect the boundary that I have set for me? Can they behave differently over time, or do they just stay the same? Can my nervous system actually feel safe around them? Those are totally different questions. Compassion explains context, but it does not erase consequence. I'm going to say that again. Compassion explains context. Yes, that may be true, but it does not erase consequence. Let that one sink in. So I look down to example number 2, the romantic repair post-betrayal. How do you repair? How do you build trust after there's a betrayal? And a romantic one at that. If you've ever been in that seat where you have been betrayed or felt betrayed by your partner or a romantic interest, whatever that might have been, it hurts. It really hurts. Why? Well, because someone close to you, someone important to you, they violated or violates trust. Maybe they lied to you. Maybe they hid something. Maybe they omitted something that they didn't even realize they were admitting. Maybe they crossed a boundary. Maybe they acted in a way that now you have to figure out how to clean up. Maybe there is a rupture that changes now the emotional reality of the relationship that the two of you are in. Then they apologize. And maybe that apology is in fact sincere. But the person who is hurt still does not feel safe. They still have questions. Their body is still scanning. Maybe that's you. And maybe you still just needed consistency. Maybe you still needed transparency, right? You still needed time. And that doesn't mean that you were being dramatic. That means that the trust that you had extended had been injured. And trust itself does not just simply rebuild because the other person feels sorry or has remorse. It builds when the injured person has enough repeated evidence that the reality that they live in is different now. Remorse, it may actually, in fact, begin the repair process. And studies show that it's an actual really healthy response for couples amongst a betrayal or whatever it was to begin that process, kickstart it for repair. But consistency rebuilds trust. And I have someone who's coming to mind, a client of mine, who their trust was betrayed. And the actions, the sorry, would come up from their partner. And so they wanted to believe in the potential. They wanted to believe that with the sorry, the behavior was going to change. But ultimately, their nervous system just needed that behavior change to the extent where she said, I don't even care about an apology at this point. I just simply need the behaviors themselves to change, right? That was her nervous system. That is exactly what we're talking about here. Now, this doesn't just happen in our families, in our romantic relationships. Where else do these layers just explode? Where else do we get hurt? Where else do we just collapse all of these layers into one? Well, the third one is professional trust, where leadership, workplace, all that fun stuff happens, because this ultimately will happen in a professional setting at one point or another, hopefully not to you, but it does. And it happens very much often, believe it or not, specifically in leadership. The person that I have written down is going through this quite literally right now. And what happened? Well, a leader, they break trust with their team. Maybe, let's say they make a promise and they don't ultimately follow through. Maybe they have asked for honesty and then punish someone for being honest. For my client in particular, this is happening in real time with the leadership team. They actually brought in a consultant to learn and understand what they're doing wrong, but then have punished those who have come forward just being honest. And maybe in this example, not the one with my client that I just brought up, but what we're talking about in this professional trust example, maybe the leadership team says that they value balance, but yet reward the overworking, the nonstop, the just going at burning at both ends. And then later they say, oh, I hear you. We want to do better. And well, that might be a start for whatever trust building is trying to happen there, but trust does not rebuild just because the leader says the right thing once. No. We all know in our nervous systems that trust rebuilds when the system itself changes, when the meeting structure changes, when the feedback is handled differently, when the boundaries themselves are respected, and when decisions, in fact, match those stated values. In leadership, reconciliation with trust in particular requires behavioral evidence. Otherwise, people may just simply comply on the outside while staying guarded and completely against what is going on the inside. And that lack of coherence essentially ripples out into the rest of the team. I can't tell you how many conversations that I've had with leaders that talk about that quote unquote one bad apple, but yet never really think about how they contributed to that quote unquote bad apple and the systems that are allowing that to occur. And here's the key. Trust is not restored just by our language alone. It is, in fact, restored by the repeated, what I mentioned earlier, congruence. And the best way that I describe that is words, actions. If words are above, what actions? What do you create? These unrealistic expectations, and that breaks trust. If there's actions but no words, there's still not congruence. So we want to restore trust by repeated congruence again and again, and that is what builds trust. Because from a nervous system perspective, when we look at it, it makes so much sense. Our nervous system just can't blindly trust things. Now, granted, some trauma survivors have learned that doing that is a survival strategy, but ultimately, when you think about it, after their harm, the body doesn't inherently ask, did they apologize? Instead, our nervous system asks, am I safe now? Has the pattern of behavior changed? Can I predict more safety here? Will my boundary that I'm laying down be respected? Will I be punished for telling the truth, or will I be rewarded? And the body will also ask, is there evidence this is different? I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where the body is talking and we're not listening. And that is why someone can intellectually forgive and yet still feel completely guarded, but then gaslight themselves as if there's something wrong with them. Their mind have maybe made a meaning, but their nervous system, it's still waiting for that evidence. And if you've been in any of those three situations that I noted down as examples, you know exactly what that feels like in your body. There's the incongruence. You feel off balance. Something's off. That's the language that I hear all the time. Now, we can name that something feels off and that there's some things that are out of whack, but we don't necessarily respect that really great as a society. And I'll just say that after having countless conversations with people. It's like, well, have you asked your body what's going on there? Have you even checked in with your body and what it's asking? And yet when the answer comes up and it's like, oh, well, I'm actually waiting for some evidence, we're not necessarily respecting that. But we have to respect that, because forcing that reconciliation before the body feels safe is not healing. I see this again and again. And what it actually is often self-abandonment. Now, hang with me, because this is where a lot of the advice that we'll see, and that's very clickbaity and sexy and crazy right now, especially in this time of information overload. From my perspective, all of this information and advice about forgiveness, not only does it become too simplistic, but it's honestly a little bit way too fluffy. And if you're here at EVE or you're an evolver listening to this, or something has brought you to this, you kind of know that, right? Your body's telling you that on a nervous system layer. The fluffy content says, well, just forgive so that you can be free, or let loose, it's fine, like everything will all just work out in good time. And something, truth be told, it feels freeing to forgive. Yeah, true. So that can be the case that forgiveness is in fact freeing. But if forgiveness is used to rush you back into an unsafe access with a specific relationship, be that romantic, be it professionally, be it even family, what it becomes is called bypassing. What you do is you skip over that nervous system that is sending up these huge flares. And there's only a matter of time where that will happen in one relationship, to where if that pattern's coming up, you'll see it in other relationships that you have, just a complete bypassing of your nervous system. What does it also skip? Well, it skips the level of accountability that we need. It skips needing and knowing that change behavior is critical for you. It skips you as the injured person, your own reality. So the better question, in my opinion, is not only, hey, have I truly forgiven? The better questions are, in fact, not even about that at all. The better questions are around the aspect of, has repair happened? Has accountability happened? Has behavior changed? Does my system have evidence that is indisputable and objective evidence that this relationship, family, romantic, professional, that this relationship is safe now? If we're not asking those questions, we're not addressing this topic beyond that surface level BS. So I'm going to invite you into asking those questions for you the next time that you feel your body, the next time you notice your nervous system, the next time that there is a rupture, or you're feeling pulled to needing an apology, or you're recognizing yourself fall into that trap of falling in love with potential. That happens all the time. And I've been guilty of that way more often than I would like to admit. Now, we talked about the nervous system, and we talked about the different examples. I want to kind of see and expand this out before we get into the 3 practical tools that I'm going to bring forward about how this actually touches our identities, and identity kind of as an overarching theme. Because I think as we get into Eve, when we talk about the nervous system, that inherently helps us bump into the identity and the identities that we have. So it touches our identities on many levels. Now, why? Well, ultimately, because many people learn that being loving or being a good person or being a good and loving and a person that is, good and loving, I'll just put it that way, it actually means staying accessible. I have bumped up to this so many times, and it is a challenge for me to make sure that even I, with having all of these awarenesses, there's parts of me and identities that will really have this rub of resistance, because being loving, well, it inherently means staying accessible, right? Being forgiving means, well, tolerating more disrespect. Being compassionate means minimizing yourself. Being mature means just moving on quickly, right? But no. As a matter of fact, those are narratives that have been practically shoved down our throats based on the identities that we have inherited. Being a good daughter, a good mother, a good brother, a good sister, a good worker, a good partner, a good and loving blah, blah, blah. Insert the role or identity here. But ultimately, an integrated nervous system, an integrated identity says, well, hey, I can be compassionate and still have boundaries, right? We're seeing that duality happen again. Holding the duality of 2 truths can be present at the same time. I can be compassionate and still have boundaries. Notice how you're holding the duality of what in maybe a former identity might have felt like diametric opposites. I can't be compassionate and still have boundaries. That goes against the identities that I've had. That goes against what it means to be a good person. That goes against what it means to be loving. Now, trust me, I know. I know how uncomfortable it is to hold the two of those together. Why? Because ultimately it's our identities that have those limiting beliefs that we have chalk up again and again around what is okay behavior and thoughts and navigating certain situations and what's not. Here's where that identity, when it's integrated and we understand what we're really getting into here, is you're holding those two truths at the same time. So I can be compassionate and still have boundaries. My favorite, I can forgive and still, in fact, choose distance. And that doesn't mean I'm a bad person or a horrible human being or not loving. Two guesses which one has been hardest for me. Then I can forgive and choose distance. Okay. Yep. Okay, Amelia. Well, that's kind of kicking up on some of the identities that I think that my parts are going to really have a hard time with. Okay. I hear you. I can understand your story and why you did what you did and why you've hurt me in the way in which you have hurt me and why XYZ, and still honor my own story, why I choose to set these boundaries. I can love someone and still know they are not safe for me. That one's really, really hard when it comes to relationships. I know that. And the key here is those two truths, holding that, it's not bitterness. My favorite word in 2026 has been discernment. What we're talking about, it's not bitterness. It is, in fact, my friends, discernment. To be discerning about what the two truths that you can hold at the same time when it comes to relationships and your nervous system and your identities, when you can discern between those two and the narratives that are getting kicked up, woo, just saying, that is power. So now let's take all of this, let's kind of tie it up in a bow, and let's actually bring these understandings that have touched on the nervous system, that have touched on family, intimate relationships, leadership, professional, all that happy jazz. Let's kind of bring this on to the practical level. Okay, so now we're going to transition a little bit. And if you have your notebooks open, please journal this out and what comes up for you. If you're trying to decide, which most people are, if you're clicking on this video or you're in a situation, or I want you to think about something that's going on in your life right now, because likely there's some parts that are trying to decide whether forgiveness, repair, reconciliation, or trust rebuilding is in fact possible. I want you to start here. At the very beginning of this video, we talked about how those are all different layers and how we collapse those into one. Remember when I couldn't do the math? So 4 different layers. So step number 1 is making sure that we, in fact, separate those layers. It's like if we collapse it into one, let's, honor the fact that we need to separate them and then kind of put them in their own little buckets. That's what step 1 is all about. How do we do that, Amelia? Well, first I want you to ask, am I working on forgiveness internally, like inside of me? Has repair happened relationally? Is reconciliation actually wise given the state that I'm in, given the chapter that I'm in, given my values, given who I aspire to be, given? Has trust been rebuilt through evidence? And I don't want you to force all of these into one decision. This is why I said get your journal out, whatever comes up for you. Answer those questions, because that's going to help us at least it's kind of like an accordion, unaccordion this so you can see how many layers are stacked there and how they each exist within their own domains. So let's say you journal out your answers to those questions. Okay, now what do we do with all those layers? It might feel like a confusing mess of information and I totally get that. But this is where we separate that layered information that was all at once collapsed likely into one layer of information, and we process each one of those different. Step number 2 is looking for evidence, not potential. And I have like in huge written words down below, not potential, like underlined, big, bold, I'm talking. And this is where I find people who have been in emotionally abusive, emotionally manipulative relationships, or have grown up with parents that have been insecure and or have an insecure attachment style, they are really, really good at falling in love with potential. And so look for evidence is a skill that we have to develop. And it's not the potential that we need to look for, it's the evidence, right? So I want you to really, really highlight that as much as I did in my notes, because potential is a dangerous loop that we get into. Because why? Well, potential ultimately says and kind of sneaks that sneaky narrative to us, just slides it across the table and says they could change. But evidence, on the other hand, shows you what's binary. They either are changing or they aren't. And that is so important to remain objective there. And evidence, when evidence shows that they are changing or they are not, that is where you can actually not gaslight yourself anymore, because potential will say, oh, they understand now. But evidence on the flip side, it says they respond differently when it matters. That's what the evidence shows. That's what the evidence says. Potential will say, well, they mean well. Our family, they mean well. They didn't mean that. But evidence, what does it do? It actually shows you objectively that their behavior is becoming safer over time. Trust, like I said earlier, it needs evidence. Our nervous system, it needs evidence. Not the evidence, not the files, like I like to say, that we just all of a sudden make up and then put in there as evidence. That's the potential file. We got to burn and torch that file. We need evidence. Step number 3, let access match safety. This is where the boundary piece really comes in, because some people, they may get super emotional around forgiveness, and that's where we're really great at having all the narratives that have been told what forgiveness is all about. Kind of comes in, all that fluffy BS comes in. But here's the thing. The people who may get emotional forgiveness but not relational access, that element that's changed, that is really, really important to understand the distinction of. Why? Well, some may in fact get limited access. Some may get a slow rebuild. Some may get reconciliation over time, and others may not. The question is ultimately not about, well, what should a good person do? Why? Well, we hear our inner critic in that. The higher morality of whatever our upbringing was just impress upon us. No, it's not what should a good person do, because then comes all the invitations around what our limiting beliefs have told us a good person would do in this situation. Instead, I want to shift your focal point into the question that is actually grounded in allowing access to match safety. And so the question becomes, what level of access is supported by the evidence of safety? And that's why 1 stacks on 2, 2 stacks on 3, and 3 helps you understand that you are ultimately in the position to determine that level of access based on 1, 2, and ultimately 3. So I love how this kind of brings us into the standpoint of agency, understanding at a deep nervous system, identity, cognitive, behavioral, psychological level, and not just in this element of just pure emotions and what our upbringing said we should do, or what a good person means, or what the behavioral script is to be X, Y, or Z on the identity level. So, kind of rounding this out, if someone has hurt you and you're trying to figure out what healing for you requires, please remember that forgiveness does not require self-abandonment. Compassion, it does not require access. And understanding someone does not mean ignoring what the heck happened to you. You can forgive and still move slowly. You can care and still require objective evidence. You can release resentment and still keep the boundary. So let's all kind of bring this together. I kind of wanted that to sing for a hot sec. When we think about all of this, really what this comes down to is the sentiment here that forgiveness may happen inside of you, inside of here. But reconciliation, that happens between people in relationships. Trust, on the other hand, is rebuilt through that evidence stacking over time. So do not rush yourself back into access just to simply prove that you are healed. I know how enticing that box is. Whoop, I'm healed now. Sometimes the most evolved thing that you can do is honor ultimately what your system still needs in order to feel safe.
And if you want to dig a little bit deeper, you want to actually go a little bit further in the specific practical application in your world, join me and other evolvers at EVE Reflections, where we will dig into this together as a community, where you're not alone and where you are working on this with other evolvers. Click the link in the show notes. You'll get access to that. And I'm excited to continue this work together as we evolve together. Take care, everyone. Until next time, keep evolving.